Once we get the actual lengths of the hips, we can go ahead and start cutting them. One thing I do is, in the case of hip number 1, the rise and run relationship is 10 to 24.74. Now I can't set that on a framing square for my plumb or level cuts. So I translate those cuts to a run of 17 inches, a number I'm used to working with on hips from regular roofs. Again, I make a simple equation. 10 is to 24.74, this is for hip number 1, as x is to 17. I get 6 7/8. So for hip number 1, my plumb cut is 6 7/8 and 17. I'll do it for hip number 2. 10 is to 26.83 equals x is to 16. So I know to set my framing square for hip number 2 at 6 5/16 on the tongue and 17 on the body. And that'll give me my plumb cut and level cuts. Let's go back to hip number 1. I've got it all drawn in. I take a protractor. I hold it along the edge of the rafter. And I want to get this measurement to set my saw. One thing that can be confusing about using the protractor is what is 90 degrees on the protractor is actually 0 degrees on your saw. So this angle here, start at 90 degrees, which on my saw is actually 0 degrees, and just start counting back the degrees until I get to this angle, and that's going to give me the angle that I set my saw at. So when I count back, I come up with 15 degrees here for this angle. I go ahead and make a plumb cut on my rafter using 6 7/8 and 17 on my framing square, set my saw for 15 degrees, and go ahead and cut this all the way through. On the center line of the hip, I measure down the length of the hip, which is 25 7/8. I make that point. Now, to make this cut, I take the protractor, hold it along the rafter, and when I make these drawings, I let these lines run through to help with the protractor, setting up the protractor. Put the protractor on here. Like I said before, 90 on your protractor is actually 0 degrees on your saw, so count over from 90, count how many degrees, and I get 15 degrees for this cut. Let's come over to this side. Like I said, the protractor 90 is actually 0 on your saw. So at 90, start counting over till we get to this line, and I've got 19 degrees. So those are the wall cuts for hip number 1. To get the seat cut, after you get these backing cuts, just measure down from this center point, the center line, measure down 2 5/16, which is the height that the 2x4 common rafters end up above the plate after you put a 512 seat cut for a 3.5 inch wall. You're left with 2 5/16 worth of meat on the rafter. So after you make these backing cuts, just measure down here 2 5/16, make a level cut, and that'll be your seat cut for your hip. Now I'm going to go to hip number 2. Put the protractor along hip number 2. Start at 90 on the protractor or 0 and start counting back until you hit this line. And I get 40 degrees. Go ahead and cut this rafter all the way through. Then what I like to do is, there's this nice big flat surface, so I'm going to measure off of this cut this way. Here's 90, which is 0. Start counting back. This angle is 15. Go ahead and set the saw at 15. Measure this distance here off that edge of that rafter, And that looks to be about 2.5 inches, and make a line down the length of the rafter, and then come back and cut this off at 15, and that gives you that cut. And then go ahead and get the wall cuts. This one here is 10, 20, about 22 degrees. Measure this one here. This one is about 10, 20, 26 degrees. So you can go ahead and get those cuts. And I'll just real quickly at the end of this is coming to the end of the video, I'll just real quickly with a live hip show you the saw positions. Let's move on. Okay, let's go ahead and do the rafters. This is hip number 1. For hip number 1, the plumb cut is 6 7/8 on the tongue here and 17 at the body. We go ahead and make the plumb cut, 6 7/8 and 17. That top cut, set the saw at 15 degrees and go ahead and cut through for the top cut. The length of hip number 1 is 25 7/8, so down the center line, make a mark, 25 7/8. This side of the wall, set the saw for 15, cut all the way through. Flip the rafter over. If you remember when I did that little diagram showing the hash marks on the center line that we had to measure to get backing cuts, this side hash mark was uphill more. So come uphill a little more when you make that line and cut that wall at 19 degrees. The backing cuts for hip number 1, we came down the top edge on this side 1/4 inch, and we set the saw at 8 degrees and cut it to 0 to the center. The opposite side, we came down this top edge 3/16 of an inch all the way along, set the saw at 6 degrees, set it at 6 degrees, and cut that whole thing off. So we got that little triangle. The common rafters, height at plate here, that height there is 2 5/16. After I get this backing cut, I measure down 2 5/16 in the middle, and I cut a level cut back. And that is hip number 1. For hip number 2, the plumb cut is 5/16, 6 5/16 on the tongue, and 17 on the body. Come up, make a line, set the saw at 40 degrees from off our drawing. Cut that through. So we would have continued the cut out. I come back. I measure off here 2.5 degrees. 2.5 inches. I measure a line, mark it down, set my saw at 15 degrees. And I come back and I cut that one, that sheet cut. I come up. The center line of the rafter is actually over here. It's not at this point. If you look at that drawing, I come down, I measure 26¼ degrees. I set the saw at 30 degrees. Go ahead and make a plumb cut. Cut it to where it meets that center. Flip this over. Make a plumb cut. Cut this side at 26 degrees. Make the backing cuts off this top edge. On this side, I came down 5/16 of an inch. Set the saw at 10 degrees. Cut that side. This side, I came off the top edge down 3/8 of an inch this whole way. Set the saw at 12 degrees. I got the backing cut. And then I come here in the middle, measure down 2 5/16, and make a level C cut. One last detail. These common rafters don't run the full run of 24 inches because I have to shorten them 3/4 of an inch because of the ridge. So they frame into the ridge flush, as you all know. This common rafter, I let it go the full run. So when it meets the ridge, it's got to actually frame about 5/16 up above the ridge. That's why that's like that. So thanks again for buying the tape. Hope it helps. Which is going to be our new length of our hip, and divide that by our original run minus what we have to deduct for shortening.